Thank you for coming. Today we have a special guest speaker, Professor Emanuele Sica, who did his undergraduate work at the Sapienza University in Rome, and I think last year completed a PhD at the University of Waterloo. And right now he's a professor at RMC, just across the bridge. And we're very happy to have him to speak on his dissertation topic.
Thank you very much for coming. I know it is a busy period for everyone. This is the end of the term, so we have the exam coming up, research papers, and therefore, I will really want to thank you for coming here today, especially because it's, as people from the faculty, from the academics, we always sometimes, we tend to confine ourselves in our ivory towers, or at least, in my case, it's the Royal Military College, and to study our subjects. But it's also, of course, very, very important to disseminate our knowledge and, to make people interested, especially in a field such as history. It's such a vibrant field where, even people who are not familiar, in this case, with the topic of the Second World War and the occupation and the history of France and Italy could, hopefully get something from my presentation. Before actually beginning, I would like to extend also the thanks to the Queen's History Department, to Dr. Anthony D'Elia, to Dr. Amitava Chowdhury, who actually set it up, to Hina Mistry, thank you very much also for setting this up, so I'd like to begin right now with the topic, and as I said, as Anthony said before, this is basically my PhD research. Even though now, of course, I have upgraded it, I have honed it and did a little bit more research. As I said, the speech here will be on between pragmatism and repression, the Italian military occupation policy in France, 1940, 1943. This is a topic actually that has never been dealt with extensively at least in the Anglo-Saxon historiography. There have been a lot of books, of course, and a lot of movies also on the German occupation of France. We know pretty much a lot about it. Of course, the defeat, in June 1940, the occupation, the German occupation of northern France, the Vichy regime, the pro-Nazi collaborationist regime. Most of the people, however, that I've been talking to, did not actually realize that the Italian too occupied France. First we'll see a small stripe of land, and then a bigger actually land, big extension of 9 départements, and quite a significant, I would say, quite a significant territory, is French territory, which have been occupied for 3 years. My research is actually the research. What I wanted also to demonstrate here is the impact of the military occupation, because, and this could not be overstated, every military occupation, whatever its intent, whatever the intent of the occupying force, and is actually happened to be an intrusion in the life of the occupied population. And that was, in this case, the Italian occupation was no exception to this. But in this case, I would say the Italian at least kept their occupation policy moderate. And we will see that's not because, as some of the myths about the Italian in the Second World War said, the Italians were brava gente, the good fellows who actually were not able to commit atrocities, but because in this case the Italians actually had their own reason why to have moderate policies. This is why my research has been primarily focused on a grassroots perspective. I don't want to go too much about state to state. At the beginning, I will of course do a little bit of introduction on the approach to war, on the international relation, but then I prefer to focus mainly on the impact of the occupation on the average Joe, or in this case will be the average Jacques probably. Anyway, so before, as I said, going back to 1940, 1943, let's go to examine the international relationship, the international relations. Here, of course, the two evil guys in the Second World War, Mussolini and Hitler, and they forged, of course, a pact. Remember, at the beginning, they were not so much good friends, especially because they had the question of South Tyrol, where Italy and Germany had diverse interests. But over time, of course, because the ideology, the fascist the Nazi ideology itself has been forged, and in some ways has been inspired by the fascist one, the cult of the leader, the single party, the supreme race. Our concept actually then Hitler himself borrowed, of course, from Mussolini, from the Duce. So they were definitely bound after a few years, to forge an alliance. And remember, of course, Germany and Italy had come out of the First World War in different ways. The Germans, of course, had lost the First World War, and therefore Hitler played on the revanchist spirit of the Germans, saying that the First World War, they had been wronged, they want their territories back, and of course he played on this anger, to fuel the desire of revenge of the Germans. Italy was on the winning side of the First World War. So you could think that Italy, after all, did not have any desire of revenge. It is very true. However, Italy, the Italian position in the First World War was a little bit different, because it had been promised some compensation for entering the war. Italy entered the war only in 1915, in the First World War. And then basically at the Paris Peace Conference, Italy did not receive the territories it expected, especially as far as colonies were concerned. The Turkish and German colonies were mostly handed over to the English and the French as mandates. And therefore the Italian felt, especially Italian nationalists, felt that even though they had won the war has been not a success. This is what they do. You have the so-called myth of the mutilated victory, la vittoria mutilata, meaning that basically, they should have have some better compensation. Mussolini, of course, and his fascist regime fueled also this desire of the Italian to have the revenge, or to have their place on the sun. So basically, to have an empire who could, who could in some way mirror also the Roman Empire back in the time. And this is what they borrowed actually from Roman mythology to get, to get this kind of the ideology of the Mare Nostrum, our sea. So basically, Italy, of course, is here, and the Mediterranean was considered the hunting ground, the future expansion, the future empire, future Roman Empire, the future Italian Empire that has to be built, of course, by the Italian armies. Of course, Italy wanted Tunisia. They had Libya at that time. That was already an Italian colony. But remember, at that time, the Italians did not know that Libya, they were actually sitting on a treasure trove. The gas and oil reserve of Libya had not been discovered at that time. So the Italians thought that they were actually had the poorest land in North Africa. They definitely wanted Tunisia, where there was an Italian minority. They wanted Morocco. And important in our story, actually, they also wanted this territory here. They wanted actually the southeastern part of France. And there is a reason for that, because southeastern part of France, sorry, actually, I disentangle this line here. Okay, the southeastern part of France used to be Italian. Well, when I say Italian, it wasn't really Italian. It used to belong to the Piedmontese monarchy, which was the monarchy that created Italy in 1860. Modern Italy was at that time still a pretty young state. Has been created only in 1860, or I mean in the 60s. So basically, at that time, the territory here, the county of Nice, Monaco, and all the territories around that area, the Savoy region, were belonging to the Piedmont. And they were basically handed over by the Piedmontese monarch at that time to the French as a compensation for their help, in the war of Italian unification against the Austrian. But we will see that's the fact that the county of Nice, the Côte d'Azur, all this region belonged to the Italian and had also an important Italian minority, made it very, very valuable actually for the fascist, the fascist ideologue, and a reason for them, or reason for the Italian to actually invade France. So, in a way, Italy and France were set to be on a collision course as time went by in the 1930s. And because the Italians were focusing on this territory among the others, they also wanted, of course, all the territories here, Greece and Dalmatia, especially Dalmatia was promised after the First World War. The French grew increasingly worried that the two Latin sisters, as they were called, will basically fight each other in the Second War, fight each other in the future. In fact, there was a prominent speech on the 30th of November 1938 of the foreign minister of Italy at that time, who was Galeazzo Ciano, the son-in-law actually of Mussolini. And Ciano actually made a speech at the parliament when he broadly outlined the strategy of the future Italian state. And he boomed actually, quotation, "We will defend with inflexible steadfastness the interest and natural aspiration of the Italian nation." And it was a menacing statement, of course, against what they call the plutocracies, which were the democracies, England and France. And especially this menacing statement was cheered up by the crowd actually in the parliament, who said, in response, who roared, "Tunisia, Djibouti, Corsica, Nizza." So basically, these are part of the Italian nation. So you see here basically that the fascist rhetoric is definitely building up what in a crescendo of declaration that they wanted their territories back. So we know the rest. I mean, Italy and Germany signed the Pact of Steel in Berlin on May 1939. However, what is well less known is basically that the Italian, when after signing the Pact of Steel with the German, asked the Germans basically to stop and ask them to not go to war, at least in the next 2 or 3 years. They said to the Germans, look, I mean, we have an industrialization which is kicking in. Our industrial output is far less significant than the French and the German. Therefore, we need at least 3 or 4 years to rearm. I mean, we'll be only available to take your side in 1942. The Germans gave them a vague reassurance. I mean, they, the Hitler said, "Oh yeah, so yeah, sure. We can discuss about that, but rest assured, we won't go to war in the next time. I mean, this next period of time." Shortly thereafter, you know what happened. I mean, they strike a deal with the Russian, which actually amazed the Italian, because of course the Russian were the hated communists, far to the left spectrum of the politics, and therefore this kind of a natural alliance, which of course was done behind the back of the Italian. The Italian didn't expect that, and then you have the German invading Poland all of a sudden. The Italians were taken aback, and Mussolini asked his general, especially his chief of staff, who is General Badoglio, and you will see him here. Basically, what should they do, and if the Italian army was ready. And Badoglio told him quite frankly that the Italian armies were not ready. There were, on the paper, 63 divisions, but only 10 were available and were fully armed. There were some who were missing equipment, some were missing their officers, some were missing even their men. So there were basically, there were only pawns really on the map. That's it. And he told the Duce, look, we shouldn't actually be involved in the war, because otherwise it will be really a big, we'll make a big mess, and it will be behind against our interest. So Mussolini basically said in the first, he declared in the first actually days of the war that Italy will actually have a non-belligerence attitude. The country non-belligerence, meaning basically neutrality, but Mussolini didn't want to use the word neutral because it sounds very cheesy. I mean, at least in the minds of someone who always have touted the warrior spirit of the Italians. So he used the word non-belligerent, telling to Hitler, look, for now, we won't join you unless you give us, this amount of coal, this amount of iron, and it was an outrageous, actually, bid, and therefore, the Führer said, sorry, actually, we can't actually give you anything of this sort. So when the Germans were winning over and over in Poland, then in Scandinavia, etc., you basically had Mussolini and who was waiting to and was waiting to see what will happen. Of course, especially the victory and the routing of the French in June 1940 convinced Mussolini that probably something has to be done, because, as he said, basically Mussolini declared that I need a few thousand war dead actually to sit at the peace conference, and therefore he understood that if he didn't join the fray, he wouldn't be able actually to reap any benefit from his from the war. Therefore, Mussolini decided on the 19th of June to give order to the Italian troops basically to cross the border. The problem, of course, is that the Italian-French border are basically the Alps. And the Alps are, of course, steep mountains, very difficult to cross. So logistically, a big problem for an army to cross. It would have been a problem for every army. It was a disaster for an army that wasn't prepared, that was understaffed, that was, had poor material, and that had no preparation whatsoever for the war to come. So here, for instance, you have this interesting chalet, which in fact is a bunker used by the French, of course, and here you have some gun nest. The French had elite troops in the Alps. Their names were the éclaireurs, the section éclaireurs skieurs. These people were actually enfants du pays, meaning people who were born and live in the Alps. And the Italian actually expected the French army not to pose any kind of resistance, because they expect the French to, because at that time, of course, the French army was routed in the north by the Germans, and many Italians actually joked about it, even in their report, they joking that basically, they won't encounter we're not expecting to encounter any significant, resistance from the enemy. There were people joking, about, hey, I heard that the French girls, are very nice, and we should definitely try to date them and stuff like that. Basically, here you have, this kind of jokes, that they were cracking already, thinking that basically it will be a promenade to go from one side to the other. The result, though, was, as I said, a disaster. The French army actually, who was fighting not only for their state, but were fighting also for their families, because they, of course, had their families on the other hand, were entrenched themselves and actually basically stop the Italian columns, were stopped by a hail of bullets and artillery guns. The Italian actually had a pretty hard time, because you can see this is a kind of course, this is called the Assietta, kind of trail they had to follow. So of course, if you put guns here, and and this is what happened actually. The French always try to destroy the first actually tank was going up the trail, because all the other all the other tanks will be stopped, and therefore they had an easy time to stop the Italian. So as you can see here, basically the casualties are piling up. One thing that should be said, and was really poor luck for the Italians, is that the weather was a disaster. It was snowing, and there was a foggy weather at all time. There was even an entire unit who lost itself in a crevice, and there was who was only accounted for only after 1 week. So there was really some wild stories in there. It was very foggy. The maps were actually wrong. They were giving wrong maps. Because it was foggy, of course, the Air Force, Italian Air Force, could not intervene because they had no targets. Therefore, really an unmitigated disaster for the Italian. And this is another picture, really, of the Italian army columns really invading France. So as you can see, definitely a disaster. I should mention this because this is actually a shame for the Italian. This is actually a tank which is called the L3 tank, which was nicknamed by the Italian actually the sardines can. The reason why, because it was the only tank in the First World War that could be pierced by machine gun bullets. Terrible feat, as you can see. I mean, it looked more as a toy really than a tank. But anyway. Even bigger tanks wouldn't have saved the Italian at that time. So this is their Alpini the Alpini who were fighting. So the Italian actually managed at least to enter the only big city that was in this area, Menton. We'll talk about this city actually in a few minutes, because this city, Menton, will be, of course, the only city which the Italian will try to colonize, and the only important city they will conquer. If we look, in fact, at the map of the occupied French here, you can see that the Italian basically occupied only this region. This is actually with the armistice of Villa Incisa on the 24th of June, the Franco-Italian armistice. Basically, the two sides agreed that the Italian will occupy, for now, only a territory which was the territory where their armies, had pierced. As you can see, the Italian army went as far as 10 kilometers from the border, so not really a lot. And the only big city they occupied was Menton. In fact, some of the Italians joked that there were more goats actually than Frenchmen in the new land they had occupied, which is probably true, because there were all pastoral land, except from Menton, there was nothing much. And this is, of course, for 2,000 casualties in the Italian ranks. And if you think that it's because of this land and of 4 days of war only, of course, this is a very steep price, and not really the kind of victory, of course, that the Duce wanted. I mean, he wanted a big victory when you see that the Germans had invaded basically, and routed the French, and the Italian had made a very, very poor job here. So now I want to concentrate a little bit on the city of Menton here, because this is, as I said, the only important city that was occupied by the Italian for 3 years. And basically, before actually I start the city of Menton, a few mentioning about the Irredentis campaign that you have at that time. Irredentis is another term to say separatist. We will see that in French at that time, especially in southeastern France, you had a significant minority of Italian people. I would say 1/4 of the population was Italian, and we will see that could have played an important role actually in the Italian occupation policy. 1/4 of the Italian were 1/4 of the people living in that area were Italian. Some of them were separatists, were fascist. This is a case, for instance, they published a newspaper called Il Nizzardo, and as you can see, of course, their shibboleth here was Menton Italiana, because they wanted basically to Italianize the new area. They published this newspaper, which, to be honest, is very, very interesting to read, because of course that was their main, the main way to understand the reason behind their political agenda. And what I want to talk here is about the city of Menton. I don't know if any of you have been to Menton. My wife probably remembers that because we had a wonderful time there. It has all the Côte d'Azur. Menton is absolutely gorgeous. Menton, which is called la Cité des Citrons, the city of lemons, is actually a town which is a few kilometers from the border. I think 5, but don't hold me on that. But 5 or 10 kilometers from the Italian border. A city which has a microclimate, kind of a tropical microclimate. In fact, it used to be, at that time, until 1940, a town where the English and the French, of course, well-endowed businessmen and professionals used to spend their holidays in. Remember, at that time, the people especially spend their holidays in southern part of France in the winter, not in the summer. because they didn't go there for sunbathing, but basically because they wanted to avoid the terrible weather, the terrible English weather of the winter. And therefore they went in the winter basically in Menton. So a city definitely, as I said, which was a jewel of the Côte d'Azur. And you can see here Menton, and basically here, this is already Italy here. So you have here the border, and you can see the Italian army had to cross actually the Alps here, as you can see, very, very difficult and logistically problematic. So the Italian wanted to make Menton as kind of a showcase of their new occupation policy. We will take Menton and we will try to colonize it and to Italianize it. And therefore, what they do is, of course, you want to make Menton, which of course has been called now Mentone, as the Italian, has a full Italian town. So first thing that you do, you erase any sign, post any sign of French in the streets. So the bistro becomes bar. The shops, the alimentari, you have the alimentari shops, of course, coming on. The city halls become the municipio. Everything is definitely Italianized. More importantly for the population there, for the French population, all the French schools are closed. Now education has to be done only in Italian. In fact, the French population secretly had an underground school, in theory done, for catechism purpose by a French priest. But in truth, that was made, because the local people, of course, the French population still wanted to have their kids to learn French, and therefore you have here a classic example of an underground, of the preservation of the culture, which is so important. There is another example, of course, the best example probably is in Poland, where the German occupied Poland, and you have this underground state with the underground universities. But here also, in a minimal way, of course, in a smaller way, on a smaller scale, you have still the same goal of trying to preserve your culture. I'd like now to show you, before actually showing you, one thing that should be said about Menton, of course, is that the person who was in charge of Menton was a Italian civil commissar. This is the second one, actually. There were three. The civil commissar here is Frediani, which is this man here. He's here with his wife. So the town was given, basically, this was the supreme authority there, the supreme Italian authority. And the civil commissar has the power, I would say, of a mayor, but even more as a mayor and a police chief all together. There was still a mayor in Menton at that time, a French mayor, but it was more basically as a figurehead and not really someone who had any kind of power. In fact, he will be asked to resign and he will put in exile after a few years. So Frediani here is definitely the man in power. I would like now to show you a small clip of Mentone and a fascist parade in Mentone.
Mentone. Le truppe del presidio, dopo la rivista passata dal comandante del Corpo d'Armata di Genova, si recano ad assistere all'inaugurazione del dopolavoro delle forze armate.
So one thing here, you see here the ladies were wearing their traditional garb. This is the garb actually of the region, of the Menton. Menton is interesting because they even had a dialect there, which was actually very akin to the Ligurian dialect, so the dialect of the Italian past the border. And the Italian actually found out that if they're trying to revive this kind of autonomous spirit, they could build on that to secede Mentone basically from France. So they did that on purpose. Of course, they had their own agenda to do that. So Mentone was definitely an interesting showcase of the Italian trying to colonize France. Here you have a wedding of an Italian officer in it. But we have to say that Mentone was a failure too. The reason is that first of all, Mentone has a population of 20,000 people living before the war. Before actually the Italian went to Mentone, the city was evacuated by the French the days before the war. Many of the French who had been evacuated did not want to go back to Mentone. There's a few reasons for that. First of all, they didn't want to be subjected to the Italian laws. And some of the Frenchmen too were in fact also had also an Italian heritage. And what they feared, of course, was that there will be also enlisted in the Italian army. They will be called to arms actually by the Italian because the Italian considered them as Italian citizens. And so most of the old French population did not actually return to Mentone. The Italian tried actually to seduce some Italian from Italy to go to Mentone, but that did not really happen. I mean, there was a few people who came for work there, but Mentone was a city who still was in ruins. I mean, they had fought in Mentone after all. So going back here actually to the occupation, the other occupation, I would say, in November 1942. In November 1942, the Italian actually occupied this area, as I said, from November 1942 to September of 1943. What is important in this occupation is, in my opinion, a few things. First of all, the occupation, the invasion per se, was done because the Anglo-American had occupied North Africa with Operation Torch. And therefore, the Axis forces thought, well, the French shoreline here should definitely be buffed by our defense, and by that time, the French and the Germans and the Italians are not trusting anymore their allies in Vichy, so the pro-collaborationist regime, and therefore they decided to invade France officially to shore up the defense. So it was a pure operational, I would say, move. However, of course, many Frenchmen and many of Italian separatists here thought that the Italians were invading because they were annexing because the Italian army was willing to annex the land. That wasn't the case. In fact, the Italian army was only interested actually in defending the coastline against the prospective invasion of the Allies. The Italian army, which was a very different army than the German one, in that it was far from an ideological army. Of course, there were fascists in the Italian army too, but from the document I see, the Italian army was much more loyal to the king actually than to Mussolini. Most of the soldiers were actually, by that time, fed up by the war. They didn't want to take anymore. They want to go home, and therefore, even the army commanders understood that. Well, we won't go and buy the separatist rhetoric. And the army commanders told their their soldiers not to mingle actually with the local separatists. I mean, to stay away from politics. So the Italian army occupied here all this area. They did not occupy Marseille and Toulon. Toulon, you probably know about that. There was the scuttling the French fleet. The Germans tried actually to storm the port, and the French Navy scuttled their ships. Some of them actually managed to go away. That was a disaster for the Italian and for the German. So you had at that time in France 175,000 Italian soldiers, which was a pretty significant number. Their leader was Generale Mario Vercellino, and Vercellino made some, his occupation policy was very, very clear. He said that the soldiers should implement policy, local commanders, quotation, without faltering or weakness, but at the same time without harshness and brutality. So an occupation policy which was, on one hand, yes, we should definitely impose our authority on the local population, and we should, step up and actually, show that we are in charge here. But on the other hand, we don't want to have extremely harsh and brutal and needless laws, because of course what Vercellino and the Italian commanders feared is that you will have, if the Italian implemented a very harsh policy, such as for instance the Germans in Poland, the local population will of course revolt and rebel, and the Italian will be crushed between the anvil of an allied landing and the hammer of French resistance, which will basically crush the Italians' army. And therefore, you had here a commander who was, for very pragmatic reason, decided, we don't have the power actually to occupy most of the land. Only the shoreline was occupied. We don't want the local actually to steer trouble from the local. We don't want them to radicalize and to join the resistance. Therefore, our policy will be as moderate as possible. And as I said, as moderate as possible because, of course, a military occupation is always, as I said, always an intrusion. It's always a brutal feat. I was reading actually a few days ago a very good book, on Iraq, actually, from the perspective of the Iraqi people, and they said, even those who cheered for the American at the beginning, cheered, that were against Saddam, when they saw the American troops, they felt humiliated, or in any case, shocked. You have in your territory troops that have another uniform, that are not speaking your own language, that you don't know, not trust them. Of course, you will feel that as an intrusion, no matter what. So the Italian here, of course, tried to hone things. Of course, there were some terrible example of Italian behavior. The most endemic were actually the thefts. There were thefts everywhere from Italian soldiers to the local population. The reason especially was because they were stealing food. The Italian supply service was in terrible shapes, and in theory, the Italian troops should have been supplied by their army. However, the logistics were terrible for the Italian. Italy too was suffering from, of course, hunger at that time, and there was rationing also in Italy. So there was definitely thefts, of any of any kind. You have also some black market. The Italians were very, very resourceful as a local population. The Italian soldiers start bartering actually gas for food. Gas was extremely expensive in France at that time. It was rationed by everyone. However, the Italian armies, of course, the Italian soldiers had access to all the gas, to all, from the army. They were starving, and therefore they start bartering from the beginning. You had then a modus vivendi really between the local population and the Italian army. Other cases were of course also love affairs between Italian soldiers and local girls. There is a say that says that Italian soldiers in the Second World War were actually more interested in hunting down skirts than partisans. Well, I think this has been a little bit overstated. To be honest, when I look at the relationship which happened in France, I would say this has a kernel of truth. I mean, there is a kernel of truth in here. Of course, I don't want to say that the Germans did not do the same thing, because of course we had all this relationship with the German soldiers and French women too. But in the case of the Italian, of course, that was made possible also because the local population, many people in the local population were speaking Italian, and it was pretty much easier for them to relate to the local population. There were also a few bombing attacks. You will say, what were the French resistance doing at that time here? The French resistance in southern France was actually not faring well. There were some people from the resistance that were actually coming from Italy, the so-called fuoriusciti. So there were Italian anti-fascists who had come to southern France in the 1930s, and these were basically the more active one against the Italian army. So there were bombing attacks, there were a few ambushes, but more or less, I mean, we're talking here only of a few episodes at most. I mean, the resistance basically was not very active. In my opinion, one of the reasons why the resistance was not very active, it was also because of the moderation of the Italian policy. That was also a reason. If we want to do a summary of the Italian occupation, and that will be my last point, and then we'll open to question. I wanted here to summarize, basically, to make a comparison between the Italian occupation of France, which happened from November 1942 to September 1943, to the German one from September 1943 to July 1944. Then, basically, the Allies landed actually in southern France with Operation Dragoon, and the German actually retreated from southern France. So, same amount, kind of the same amount of period. Actually, the German one it's kind of it's the same amount, 10 months. If you compare the number of civilians killed, in Italian you have 40 civilians against 160 in the German occupation. When I'm counting here the casualties due to the occupation, of course, in the Italian case at least, we're counting everything from reckless driving. The Italians were speeding up, that they had actually this terrible, and there was a terrible prejudice about the Italians speeding up. In the case of the Italian, I can tell you it's true. There were a lot of accidents made by the Italians, especially on their motorcycle, and there were at least 10 people who were killed. 10 people who were killed in car accidents. So you see here the difference between the civilians killed in 10 months with the German one. I'm not included here the Jewish casualties, all the Jews who had been deported. I will talk about that actually in a few minutes. There was no systematic tortures in Italian prison camp. In fact, there were only two people who ended up killed in Italian prison camp. One died for a heart stroke. It's unclear if he has to do something with torture, probably not. In the case of the Gestapo, when the Gestapo, or when the Germans were in France from 43 to 44, there were several cases of torture by the Gestapo. The Gestapo actually hung people in the square, hung resistance in the square, and they showed them for a few days. So there was definitely a step up of the repression. Jews were shielded by the Italians. This is maybe something that should be said. The Jews basically, in France at that time, you had a lot of foreign Jews. Of course, many of them coming from Germany, some of them from Eastern Europe. And many of them, of course, had no states anymore, or a state that was unwilling to defend their interest. And they were, of course, especially vulnerable in Vichy France, because Vichy France itself was a regime that was deeply anti-Semitic, with anti-Semitic laws. And of course, the Germans themselves, the German occupying forces, were trying as much as possible to round up the Jews whenever they found them in France, and to send them, of course, to the extermination camp in Eastern Europe. They also asked the Italian to do that. The Italian, there were a significant number of Jews, of foreign Jews in the Côte d'Azur for a number of reasons. And the Germans and the French authorities actually asked them to ask actually the Italian to relinquish their Jews and to give them the Jews, and basically so they can be herded really in extermination camps. The Italian actually answered no. Officially, because they said, this is our problem, this is our occupation area, we do what we want, so it was assertion of sovereignty, But on the other hand, you find out, if you look at the archives, that there was clearly a will actually to save them, which is actually very surprising. You had this man, Angelo Donati. He was a Jewish banker from Modena. Angelo Donati was pretty well known he has a big connection in the Italian military too. He actually knew Vercellino, and he told Vercellino, look, I know that you have a lot of Jews here, and I want to create something to save them. And he set up a committee actually in Nice, whereas he will pay for the trip of all these foreign Jews who had no papers, who had no money in many cases, who were completely homeless. I will send them actually in some beautiful villages, alpine resorts such as Saint-Martin-de-Vésubie, and my wife remembers that. We went there, actually it was snowing, the weather was very different from this weather, but an amazing and cozy alpine village. And the Jews were actually, sent to this village, and they could live a normal life, provided that they signed actually twice per day to the local Italian presidio, and they could, the local Italian police, and they actually did not work. They couldn't work, but they were anyway funded by Angelo Donati and his committee. And the French police always ask, but you have these people here, and they're living in this village, and we know that. And the Italians said, don't worry about them, you should actually see them as if they were living in a concentration camp. Actually, this is actually what the Italian local commanders told to the Vichy police, you should consider them as they were living in a concentration camp, which of course was not true. I mean, they could even pray, something which was by 1943 very unusual in Axis-occupied Europe. The Jews could even have their own, worship, their own ritual without any problems. The real reason behind this moderation, my last point, because my question is not so much the fact that the Italian policy in this area was moderate, but why it was moderate. I would say 2 points here: cultural proximity and sheer pragmatism. I would say it is when the occupiers and the occupied can relate more easily, the occupation policy will be more easy. There's a few reasons for that. First of all, there will be less misunderstanding because of the language between the occupiers and the occupied. And this is a big thing. I mean, that you see how many incidents can happen because you are not speaking the same language, or you can't actually understand what the person are saying and is yelling, for instance. And it is much more easy to relate to a person and to consider him or her human if you can actually relate to the person by culture. This is what was the problem, of course, of the German in Poland or in Russia. They did not actually consider the people they had in front of them as human beings. Here with the Italians, it's completely different. You had the Italian you had some Italian soldiers who actually found some immigrants not only from their region, but even from their village in France. And they start talking to each other, they start eating, and dating in some cases. So really this cultural proximity, which in my opinion can definitely explain the moderation. Of course, it's not easy to demonstrate in the sense that you won't have ever a document from a commander that says, oh, I'm moderate because I can relate to these people. So that's my PhD the defense actually committee told me, well, this is not very easy to demonstrate. It's true. But in my opinion, it makes sense because it is very plausible. On the other hand, the second reason is sheer pragmatism. As I said, the nightmare scenario for the Italian army is the hammer of an Allied landing in the anvil of the French resistance, and that could be only avoided with a moderate policy. The Italian army commanders were very keen to understand that their forces were overstretched, the morale of the army was extremely low, and therefore that was the only way they could definitely make the occupation last. And the occupation lasted until September. Well, of course, then you have the armistice with the Italian state. But in my opinion, it was a rather successful occupation in many ways, and a rather moderate one, and an interesting one to study, especially if we compare with the German occupation of France, and if we compare it actually with the Italian occupation of Yugoslavia, of Greece, which was actually a more brutal occupation where the Italian committed atrocities, in my opinion also because they saw the people in Yugoslavia as people who were inferior, an ethnic group who was inferior, and therefore you can see here the point number one about the cultural proximity. Okay, that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much for. So I'm open to questions. Yes.
Thanks very much. Several questions. I'll just ask one now. In this first round, you mentioned that there seems to have been a moderate policy in the treatment of the Jews, and that they didn't turn over, I guess, just foreign Jews. So they're refugees or people who had been visiting there during the time period when Italian occupation took place. It does seem, though, that even if the conditions of their separate internment was different, that they are separated out by the Italian occupation authorities. They're not living in Menton and part of daily life. So I'm wondering what you think about that, and then secondly, what happens to them after the armistice? Are they relocated to their previous territories? Are they in refugee camps elsewhere, or are they deported like so many refugees who are often unwillingly to new state of Israel after a couple of years? So what happens to them?
No, these are.
Villages?
Thank you. These are actually two very good questions. But the first one, it should be mentioned that when there's this rumor that the Italians are saving the Jews, you have at least 20,000 Jews from the German occupying area, which are literally storming the Italian occupation area. So this is why the Italian actually created this committee, because all of a sudden you have 10,000s of Jews, most of them homeless, of course, without ration cards, so they cannot eat. and they're completely destitute in many cases, and are frightened, of course, and hunted down by the French police. Why they put them in this village? At first, they thought actually of creating, of helping them also in Nice. But there were two problems with that. First of all, they will be subjected to French laws, and they could be actually arrested by the French police. And the French police was still in force at that time, of course. And you had some cases where actually the Italian had to free actually the Jews from the French police because they were arrested. And therefore, it was easier, definitely, to protect them if you set them in a village, in a confine of a small village where there's the Italian army, and therefore, it was easier, definitely, to have as a buffer. Of course, the Italians said, you should consider them as a concentration camp because for obvious reason. About the second question you ask, this is a sad story, unfortunately. I know the story especially about Saint Martin de Vésubie because there is also a very good book written about it. When the Italian, of course, left in September 1943, as you may know, the Italian armistice was basically declared on the radio. Many of the soldiers and the commanders in France did not know anything about the armistice. I mean, you had some cases of the Italian commander who was dining with his German commander, local German commander, in France, and they heard about the armistice, and they look at each other and said, well, this is awkward. I mean, because definitely, I didn't know anything about it, nobody told me, and basically you have the German who said, well, seize him because now you are my enemy. So it was absolutely a kind of grotesque situation. Here, when the armistice kicks in, the local army, the local unit, says to the Jews, okay, you are in big trouble because the German will sweep over here and we won't be able to protect you anymore. So we are crossing the border. I don't have actually, Saint Martin de Vésubie is just across the border with Italy. But bear in mind, it's steep mountains on the other part, it's the Alps. But there is kind of a trail that goes to Italy. And the Italian army said, we will cross the border. If you want, you can join us. And we will try to protect you. And they actually have a kind of a Russian trail, especially because, of course, some of these Jews were old, very old people, or very young. I mean, you had even toddlers. And they had to cross, of course, for miles and miles of steep trail. And therefore, they tried to set it up. The problem is that the Germans were waiting in Italy. The Germans already occupied Italy, and they knew what was going to happen. And therefore, they arrested the Italian, and they arrested pretty much all the Jews, and they shipped them actually to Auschwitz. Many of them died in Auschwitz in the extermination camp. So it is a very sad tale because only a few survived, really. It is this event. I mean, the Germans were expecting that anyway. Yes.
That was a really fascinating talk. Thank you, Professor. I was wondering, you said at various points you would refer to the documents and how you're correcting some, common notions about the occupation, looking at the documents. I was wondering what kind of documents you're looking at, what kind of archives are these, and also if there was much, if there were resistance documents, sources for that. There must have been some kind of resistance that you started out to talking about how difficult it was for the Italians to invade. That the French troops were firing down on them and everything. So I mean, it must not have been that peaceful when they took over. I would think there would be a resistance group resisting it. Well, you said with the school and things like that. What kind of sources have you looked at for this? Are they mainly Italian, or is there, and how do you correct these different interpretations?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, and the sources, of course, are important. Well, I use different sources, both in French and Italian, because, of course, I want to get the perspective both of the occupiers and the occupied. So, of course, l'Archive nationale in Paris, the first one, and the equivalent in l'Archivio dello Stato in Italy. The Italian military archives, of course, also very important because you have the reports of all the commanders, and the commanders sometimes also make some significant comments on not only on their soldiers, but of course on the local population, the moods, and stuff like that. For this research, however, because I want to have a more grassroots approach, I found the Archives départementales, so the local archives in France. I especially went to 3 of them: the Archives départementales in Nice, des Alpes-Maritimes, the one actually in the Basses-Alpes, well, now called the Alpes de Haute-Provence, and the one in Draguignan, the one for the Var region. So these local archives, I found it very, very useful. First of all, because the local archivist will be extremely enthusiastic to see you. They call me actually the Canadian guy. Oh, you're a Canadian guy. I told them, no, I'm Italian. No, you're a Canadian. So, you're from North America. So they actually give me full access to all their boxes, even some boxes that I shouldn't have actually seen because they had the dérogation, meaning especially the boxes about the military, the justice, the court, the épuration after the Second World War. I actually had, the guy said, normally you should wait 6 months, but you know what, I like you, so I'm probably handing it to, so basically it was very, very nice, and I got a lot because in these boxes you had all the Italian separatists, all the dossier of the Italian separatists in there, so lots of information, really great information for me. So I found the local archives in this case were much more important than the national one, because they gave me really, day-to-day, really, day-to-day report on what was happening. About the resistance, it is true, the resistance is not playing a big role in my story. In my opinion, it is not playing a big role until September 1943. Then when the Germans start to kick in, the resistance has definitely an upgrade in the area. The reason, as I said, there are several reasons for that. First of all, the southern France has been always a very right-wing region in France. In some ways it still is. And therefore, the local resistance, left resistance, was pretty much, I wouldn't say non-existent, but it was very, very minimal. Many of the people in southern France actually were supporters of the Maréchal of Vichy, the Vichy regime, and therefore they were not really, in the mood of resisting, I would say. As I said, in my opinion, also the moderation of the Italian policy plays a part in this non-resistance attitude, or a passive resistance attitude, I would say. I mean, there was, of course, passive resistance. There were, people who would say down with the Italian and stuff like. I mean, you have, of course, hostility. I wouldn't say that the French were, of course, were happy about the occupation, but as soon as they understood that the Italians did not want to annex the region, and the Italian army could not care less about the local separatists, they were actually pretty much fine. They said, okay, maybe these guys are not so bad after all, because they're not here actually to annex, they're only here because they're showing up, and they're not actually taking part of any of any big repression. There were some roundups, but as I said, it wasn't as wide, as brutal as it seems. So I would say resistance, I didn't find much on the resistance, to be honest. I know there is a local historian who is actually a former resistance fighter, and we talk about it a little bit, but it's, in my opinion, the resistance was not a major player at that time. The major player was the local population, the Italian army, and the French authorities, the Vichy authorities. These were the major players until September 1943. Yes?
I have another one, thanks. It follows a little bit from that, your answer about why there wasn't so much resistance and all of that. You mentioned this is attitudes or views to the Italian fascists, and particularly because you mentioned you showed that map of these kind of neo-Roman Mediterranean ideals of the fascist regime that included, colonization of North Africa, trying to take Tunisia, and I wondered, there's a lot of interest in like the French, so-called French, the people who come Pied Noir. They talk about a kind of Mediterranean-ness, and so I wondered if there was some kind of ideology like that about that might have made the French more, at least the right-wing French, more, I don't know, congenial to the Italian expansion in some ways, certainly in terms of preference over the Germans and things like that. I was just wondering if you could comment on that, and also where does this idea that Tunisia should be, Italian in the same way that you mentioned Nice and Corsica, I think, or something, where the other two areas and Tunisia is like we must have Tunisia. Is this like because of the Punic Wars, or why are they so interested in Tunisia as a claim fruit?
Okay, so lots of questions about possible. I was thinking also about that, possible relationship or relation between the, I don't know, the Italian. I mean the German, no, sorry, the French far wing and the Italian. The Italian state, actually, Mussolini pretty much funded some radical right-wing French groups. For instance, the Parti Franciste de Bucard, I think, very, very radical, small groups. But you don't really have any kind of very, very loose ties with the Italian, and with the Italian fascists and the local French. In this case, they were especially opposed. I mean, the separatists and the right-wing French could agree maybe on a few things, but on the county of Nice, I mean, they all disagree, of course. The Vichy regime called Nice la fille aînée de la Révolution, so the eldest daughter of the revolution. And in fact, you had all the Vichy ministers who, one by one, will come to speak in Nice. In fact, the Italian joke, because they said Nice has become the Mecca of the Vichy regime, basically. I mean, everyone had to go there and basically pay their respect. So I don't see, any kind of relationship between the two. About Tunisia, I would say, well, there was a significant Italian minority in Tunisia, which had colonized Tunisia itself. That was part of the Italian idea of the Mare Nostrum. In any case, I mean, the fact that the Italians wanted to expand their empire in Northern Africa, because it was kind of mirroring what happened with the Roman Empire, of course, and when they destroyed Carthage, which was in Tunisia, and therefore they wanted to expand on the footsteps of the Roman Empire commanders, and I think that was why Tunisia. But not only Tunisia, but also Tunisia played an important role in the rhetoric, of course, of the Italian fascist state at that time.
Because it was under French colonial rule during that time.
Yes, and in fact, it was still under the Vichy regime. Vichy actually had still its own empire until basically it was invaded by the Anglo-American. The Vichy authority, Vichy was nominally still in place, and in fact, the Italian, when in the armistice of Villa-Incisa in 1940, the Italian asked actually the German if they could get the Tunisia, some of the French colonies, but the Germans said no, we don't want them. We don't want you to have their colonies. Otherwise, the Vichy regime would not collaborate, and basically, we will have the Vichy regime against us. It will radicalize them. So. But the Italians were very grumpy about that. They definitely wanted, the Tunisia. Tunisia was a big thing, also a big thing. I mean, it wasn't the only thing, but was definitely the colony they wanted.
I have two related questions. That's really interesting. First of all, about the spazio vitale, was that purely imperialistic, purely ideological, or was there an overpopulation problem in Italy? They needed space, kind of, you know, the Lebensraum thing. That's the first part. And then the second part, in terms of the Mare Nostrum, is I know it was earlier than this, but where does Ethiopia fit into all that? Because that's not, you know, geographically, right, off to the side sort of thing, right?
Yes, I mean, let me get the Mare Nostrum slide. It's foreign trench.
I mean, the Romans, I think the Romans got that far.
The- No, I mean the Mare Nostrum, of course, no. It goes to basically to Algeria, Morocco, Libya, even Egypt. Of course, Egypt at that time was English. This is why the Italians actually invade, of course, Egypt, and they fare poorly. So this is why also you have the Africa Corps, basically the Germans joining in. Sorry, the question will be, so the first one is, was it a pure expansion or was also overpopulation? I think there was always, as you know, the colonialism in 19th century, always this thing about we can colonize and bring, you know, some of our poorest people or people who have no land, landless farmers, you know, to the other regions. But we know that even in the 19th century, that was merely an excuse, much of the time for, you know, for this is, I think, more about power projection, about really prestige. You know, the Italian now has, you know, we want to have our own empire. Germany is carving its own empire in Eastern Europe. We're fine with that. We have no interest in there. You know, they can do whatever they want with Russia, with Poland, and whatever. This is our hunting ground. We actually want, you know, the Mediterranean Sea to be our, you know, our private hunting ground. You know, our, you know, all the people here in Greece, Albania, Dalmatia will be subjected to the new Roman and Italian Empire, fascist empire, and Mussolini will be the new emperor or the king. Well, depend, but probably Mussolini. Therefore, I think it was more a problem of power projection, really.
Yeah. It seems different though once you use the term spazio vitale, right? It's the living space that you need. You know, we need to expand to create more living space. But I guess
it's true. No, it's true. I think I'm not sure exactly because I'm not a specialist on that, but it's true that it seems like as Lebensraum with the German one. So it's kind of and it is possible that the Italian actually took over also something from the German in there, and they basically there was also, of course, a racial undertone. Well, it was especially a big racial undertone in there. So it is true that Spazio Vitale could think that, but I think it's we're talking here also about mainly about power projection of the prestige, really, of having. You know, of bringing the true civilization basically to people who are considered. But this is why the case of France is strange, because France had a superior in some ways civilization, or at least not superior, I would say, but has you know, in the minds of many Italians, they couldn't say, oh, the French, you know, are poor people who are uneducated. They could say that, you know, for the people in North Africa. They could say that for Greek. They could say that for the people in Croatia, even though it might be not true, because in their opinion. But they couldn't say that for the French, because there were 2 million actually Italian who went actually to France to work, to emigrate in 1 century. And therefore it was the other way around. It was Italy who was the poor country in the eyes of the French. And in fact, you know, for the Italian regime to have so many Italians in France was kind of a stain, really. This is why they wanted also to avoid having too much relationship with the local population. It was actually also even the fascist civil servants who were sent, you know, in France at that time, the ambassadors wanted to avoid to have many relationship with the local population to a certain extent, because the fact that there was a big Italian colony was itself showed that Italy had been a very poor country. And in fact, the Italian regime tried everything to get them back to Italy, except that even then Italy started to have, you know, their rationing problem, their food problem, and then they stopped. So that you know, there was this kind of attitude you have in Italy between, well, we are a big power, but on the other hand, the fact that we have a lot of people who have been living in France, it shows that, we used to be a very, very poor country, which is true. Italy in 1860 was, for the standards of Western Europe, was definitely, a poor country.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.